The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the juvenile courtroom as 12-year-old Marcus Webb sat stiffly in the wooden chair beside his court-appointed guardian, Mrs. Patricia Green. His hands were folded in his lap, but they trembled slightly no matter how hard he tried to keep them still. The room smelled like old wood and floor cleaner, and something else Marcus could not quite identify, but it made his stomach turn. He wore his only dress shirt, which was a little too small now, and his best pants that his mom had ironed 3 times that morning before she left for her double shift at the hospital. She had wanted to be there, but they could not afford for her to miss work, and Marcus had told her he would be fine even though he did not feel fine at all. Judge Harold Brennan sat behind the high wooden bench, looking down at the papers in front of him, with an expression that seemed carved from stone. He was an older man with gray hair slicked back from his forehead and reading glasses that sat low on his nose. Marcus had heard Mrs. Green whisper to another lawyer that Judge Brennan had been doing this job for over 20 years, and that he had seen everything. The way the judge looked at Marcus, though, made the boy feel like he was already guilty before anyone had said a word. It was the same look some of his teachers gave him when something went wrong in class and they automatically assumed he was involved. It was a look that made Marcus feel small and invisible and angry all at the same time. The prosecutor stood and began reading the charges in a flat voice that made it sound like Marcus had committed some terrible crime instead of defending his friend from bullies. Marcus tried to listen, but the words seemed to bounce off his ears without making sense. Assault, battery, willful defiance. The words were too big and too serious for what had actually happened in the school parking lot 3 weeks ago. All he had done was help Kyle when those older boys were hurting him. That was what his dad had taught him to do. Stand up for people who cannot stand up for themselves. Use your strength to protect, not to harm. These were the lessons Marcus had learned since he was old enough to understand words. Judge Brennan finally looked up from his papers, and his eyes settled on Marcus with an expression that made the boy want to shrink into his chair. The judge cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that filled the entire courtroom. He asked Marcus if he understood why he was there, and Marcus nodded because his voice felt stuck in his throat. The judge frowned and told him to speak up, and Marcus managed to say, "Yes, sir," even though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Judge Brennan then asked him what he had to say for himself, and Marcus took a deep breath, trying to remember what Mrs. Green had told him about being respectful and honest. Marcus explained that he was walking to the bus after school when he heard someone crying. He said he went to check and found his friend Kyle Simmons on the ground with 3 8th-grade boys standing over him. They were taking turns pushing Kyle and calling him names, and one of them had just kicked him in the side when Marcus arrived. Marcus said he told them to stop and to leave Kyle alone, but they just laughed at him. He said he tried to help Kyle stand up, but one of the bigger boys, Brad Carson, pushed Marcus hard in the chest. Marcus said he did not want to fight, but when Brad kicked Kyle again while he was down, Marcus knew he had to do something. He used a move his martial arts instructor had taught him for self-defense, and swept Brad's leg, putting him on the ground without hurting him. Then Marcus stood between Kyle and the other 2 boys with his hands up, telling them it was over and they should walk away. Judge Brennan listened to this explanation with his lips pressed into a thin line, and when Marcus finished, the judge shook his head slowly. He said he had heard every excuse imaginable in his courtroom over the years, and that Marcus's story sounded like just another attempt to avoid responsibility for violent behavior. Marcus felt his chest tighten with frustration because he was telling the truth, but the judge was not listening. Mrs. Green tried to interrupt to present evidence, but Judge Brennan held up his hand and told her he would hear from her in a moment. First, he wanted to address the young man before him who apparently thought fighting was acceptable. The judge asked Marcus where he learned to fight like that, and Marcus answered honestly that his father had enrolled him in martial arts classes when he was 7 years old. Judge Brennan asked where his father was now and why he was not in court supporting his son. Marcus felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He sat up straighter and said his father was deployed overseas on a classified mission because he was a Navy SEAL. Marcus said his dad was Commander Jacob Webb and that he had taught Marcus to always protect people who needed help and to never use violence unless there was no other choice. He said his father was a hero who served his country and that everything Marcus knew about honor and courage came from him. The courtroom went quiet for a moment, and then Judge Brennan did something that made Marcus's stomach drop. The judge laughed. It started as a small chuckle but grew into a full laugh that echoed off the walls. Other people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one said anything. Judge Brennan took off his glasses and wiped his eyes, still shaking his head with amusement. He said he had presided over thousands of cases involving young men who made up stories about absent fathers. He said Marcus's tale about having a Navy SEAL for a dad was one of the more creative ones he had heard, but it was still just a fantasy. The judge said that Marcus's father was probably in prison, somewhere, or more likely the boy did not even know who his father was and had invented this story to make himself feel better about coming from a broken home. Marcus felt like he had been slapped across the face. His hands clenched into fists on his lap and his whole body went rigid with anger and hurt. Mrs. Green put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed gently, trying to calm him, but Marcus could barely breathe. He wanted to shout at the judge that he was wrong, that his dad was real and was a hero and was coming home soon. But the words would not come out because there was a lump in his throat the size of a baseball. Judge Brennan continued talking, saying that lying to the court was serious and that it only made Marcus's situation worse. He said young men like Marcus needed to learn that actions have consequences and that making up stories about military heroes was disrespectful to the real men and women who served. Mrs. Green stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. She said she had evidence that Commander Webb was exactly who Marcus said he was, and that she had been trying to contact him through military channels for weeks. Judge Brennan cut her off and said he had heard enough. He declared that Marcus Webb was clearly a troubled young man who had assaulted another student and then compounded his offense by lying to the court. The judge said he was sentencing Marcus to 60 days in juvenile detention, followed by 1 year of probation and mandatory counseling. He said perhaps some time thinking about his choices would teach Marcus the difference between fantasy and reality. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet courtroom. Officer Danny Price, the bailiff, moved toward Marcus to take him into custody. Marcus felt numb all over, like this was happening to someone else and he was just watching from far away. Mrs. Green was talking rapidly, saying she wanted to file an immediate appeal, but her voice sounded distant and muffled. Marcus thought about his mom and how disappointed she would be and how scared. He thought about Kyle, who was probably still hurt and scared too. Most of all, he thought about his dad halfway around the world fighting for people he did not even know, while his own son was being called a liar for telling the truth about him. Then the courtroom doors burst open with a bang that made everyone jump. Judge Brennan straightened in his chair, trying to recover some measure of dignity, though his hands still trembled against the wood of his desk. He said he wanted to hear from the witnesses before making any further rulings. Mrs. Green nodded and gestured toward the courtroom doors where several people had been waiting throughout the proceedings. The first person called was Kyle Simmons, a small 11-year-old boy with bright red hair and a face full of freckles. He walked slowly to the witness stand with his mother, Linda Simmons, right beside him, holding his hand. The boy looked nervous, glancing at the judge and then at Marcus before his eyes settled on Commander Webb and the other SEALs. Something about their presence seemed to give him courage because he sat up straighter when he took his seat. Kyle's voice was quiet at first, but it grew stronger as he told his story. He said he had been waiting for his bus after school when 3 8th-grade boys cornered him near the bike racks. He said they took his backpack and started going through it, throwing his books on the ground and laughing. When he tried to get his things back, one of them pushed him hard against the brick wall. He said they were calling him terrible names, saying nobody cared about him because his dad was not around anymore. Kyle's voice broke a little when he said that part, and his mother squeezed his shoulder. He continued, saying that when he tried to walk away, they surrounded him and would not let him leave. Then Marcus showed up and everything changed. Kyle explained that Marcus did not come in swinging or yelling. He walked up calmly and told the older boys to leave Kyle alone and give him his stuff back. The biggest one, Brad Carson, laughed and said Marcus should mind his own business or he would get hurt too. Marcus did not back down, though. He kept his voice steady and told them this did not have to turn into a problem and they should just walk away. Brad shoved Marcus, but Marcus barely moved. He just kept his hands at his sides and kept talking, trying to calm everything down. That was when Brad turned back to Kyle and pushed him so hard that Kyle fell to the pavement. Before Kyle could get up, Brad started kicking him in the ribs, and that was when Marcus finally acted. The boy described how Marcus moved faster than Kyle had ever seen anyone move. He grabbed Brad's kicking leg and swept the other one out from under him, putting Brad on the ground in one smooth motion. Then Marcus stood between Kyle and the other two boys with his hands up in a defensive position. He told them the fight was over and they needed to help their friend up and walk away. Kyle said Marcus never threw a punch, never hit anyone, never did anything except defend him from being hurt worse. The two other boys grabbed Brad, and they all ran off cursing and threatening to get Marcus back. Marcus helped Kyle gather his books and stayed with him until a teacher came. Kyle looked directly at Judge Brennan and said if Marcus had not been there, he would have been hurt much worse, maybe even had to go to the hospital. Linda Simmons spoke next, her voice tight with emotion. She said her son came home that day with bruised ribs and a black eye that he had not wanted to tell her about because he was embarrassed. When she finally got the story out of him, she immediately called the school to report what happened. The vice principal told her they were already aware of an incident and that Marcus Webb had been identified as the aggressor. She tried to explain that Marcus had saved her son, but the administrator said they had multiple witnesses saying Marcus attacked Brad Carson without provocation. She said she tried to file a police report, but the officer who took her statement seemed more interested in Marcus's supposed discipline problems than in the fact that her son had been assaulted. She said she felt helpless and angry that the boy who had protected Kyle was being punished, while the actual bullies faced no consequences. The next witness was Sophie Martinez, a 15-year-old girl with long dark hair and intelligent eyes. She said she had been walking to her car with friends when she saw the whole thing happen from about 30 feet away. She confirmed everything. Kyle had said, adding details that made Judge Brennan shift uncomfortably in his seat. Sophie said she watched Marcus try to de-escalate the situation for at least 2 full minutes before anything physical happened. She said Marcus kept his body language non-threatening and his voice calm the whole time. She said Brad and his friends were clearly looking for a fight, and Marcus was clearly trying to avoid one. When Brad kicked Kyle while he was down, Sophie said she yelled at them to stop, but they ignored her. She described how Marcus defended himself and Kyle with what looked like trained movements, not wild fighting. After it was over, Marcus checked on Kyle first before even looking at Brad and his friends. Sophie said she had given a statement to the school, but was told her version of events contradicted what the teachers had reported. David Chen was the third witness, a 16-year-old boy who wore glasses and carried himself with quiet confidence. He had been leaving chess club when he saw the confrontation start. He said he immediately recognized it as a bad situation because Brad Carson and his friends were known bullies who had been causing problems all year. David said he ran back into the school to get help as soon as he saw them surrounding Kyle. By the time he returned with the vice principal, the fight was over, and Marcus was helping Kyle pick up his scattered belongings. David said the vice principal immediately assumed Marcus was the problem and grabbed him roughly by the arm. David tried to explain what really happened, but the administrator told him to mind his business. David said he submitted a written statement the next day, but never heard anything back. He said he was shocked when he learned Marcus was being charged with assault when all he had done was stop one. Commander Webb listened to each testimony with the same intense focus he brought to mission briefings. When the witnesses finished, he addressed the court again. He explained that Marcus had been training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu since age 7, not to make him a fighter, but to give him confidence and the ability to protect himself and others without causing serious harm. He said what the witnesses described was exactly what Marcus had been taught to do in that situation. Try to talk first, use verbal de-escalation, and only use physical intervention as a last resort when someone was in immediate danger. He said, the techniques Marcus used were designed to control an opponent without striking them without causing injury, beyond what was necessary to stop the threat. He said his son had done everything right and was being punished for it. Lieutenant Palmer added that these same principles were taught in special operations training. He said violence was always the last option, not the first. He said soldiers were trained to assess threats to determine if force was necessary and to use the minimum amount needed to accomplish the mission. He said what Marcus did in that parking lot demonstrated better judgment than many adults would have shown in the same situation. Chief Cole nodded and said Marcus had protected an innocent person, stopped the threat, and avoided escalating the violence. He said those were the actions of someone with discipline and training, not a troubled kid looking for a fight. Judge Brennan reviewed the statements and witness testimonies spread across his desk. His face had gone through several color changes during the proceedings and now settled into a pale gray. He looked at Marcus, then at Commander Webb, then back at the papers in front of him. He removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly as if buying time to think. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its earlier authority and harshness. He said the court had heard compelling evidence that Marcus Webb acted in lawful defense of another person who was being assaulted. He said the witness testimony was consistent and credible and supported Marcus's account of events completely. He said the charges against Marcus had been based on incomplete information, and he was ashamed to admit on assumptions that had no place in a courtroom. The judge said he was vacating the sentence he had issued earlier in its entirety. He said, after reviewing all the evidence, he was dismissing all charges against Marcus Webb. He said Marcus had shown restraint, courage, and maturity that many adults lacked, and that instead of punishment, he deserved recognition. Mrs. Green smiled, but Judge Brennan was not finished. He said the court had a responsibility to address the actual perpetrators of the assault. He ordered the prosecutor to file charges against Brad Carson and his 2 accomplices for assault and battery on a minor. He said he wanted the school district to review why the incident had been mischaracterized in their initial report and why witness statements had been ignored. He told Officer Price to update all court records to reflect the dismissal and to document that Marcus Webb had been wrongly charged and wrongly treated by this court. Linda Simmons stood up from the gallery and asked permission to speak. Judge Tew Brennan nodded, and she said she had tried to tell the police the truth, but the officer taking the report said Marcus had a history of discipline issues and the school had reported him as the aggressor. She said she felt helpless watching the wrong person get punished. Commander Webb's expression darkened and he asked what discipline issues. Mrs. Green pulled out yet another file from her briefcase and explained that Marcus had been sent to the principal's office 3 times that school year. Commander Webb spoke with measured words that carried the weight of hard-earned authority. He said he did not want special treatment for his son because of his military service, but he did want Marcus treated fairly like every child deserved. He said what happened in this courtroom was a symptom of a much larger problem. He asked how many other children had stood in that same spot and been judged not on facts but on assumptions and prejudices. He asked how many parents could not afford to take time off work to defend their kids. He asked how many children did not have a team of Navy SEALs who could walk through those doors and demand justice. The questions hung in the air heavy with implications that made everyone in the courtroom uncomfortable because they all knew the answers even if nobody wanted to say them out. Loud Petty Officer Murphy, who had been silent until that moment, stepped forward. His voice was quiet but intense when he spoke. He said he had been one of those kids without anyone to speak for him. When he was 14, he got arrested for shoplifting even though he had not stolen anything. He was in a convenience store when another kid grabbed some candy and ran out. The security guard saw Murphy standing near the door and assumed he was involved because he was a black kid in a hoodie. The guard grabbed him and called the police, and nobody believed Murphy's story. His mother was working 3 jobs trying to keep food on the table and could not take time off for court dates. The public defender barely spoke to him before his hearing. The judge looked at Murphy's address in a poor neighborhood, looked at his skin color, and decided he was guilty. Murphy spent 6 months in juvenile detention for something he did not do. He said that experience could have ruined his life, but a military recruiter saw something in him that nobody else had bothered to look for. The recruiter helped him get his record expunged, helped him finish high school, and showed him a path forward. That was why Murphy wore the uniform now. But he said he thought about that judge every single day. He wondered how many other kids that judge had sentenced based on appearance rather than evidence. He wondered how many lives had been destroyed by assumptions and bias. He looked at Marcus and said the boy was lucky to have a father who taught him right from wrong and who came home to fight for him. Not every kid had that, and the system needed to work for all of them, not just the ones with parents who could demand justice. Sophie Martinez, who was still in the courtroom, raised her hand tentatively and asked if she could say something. Judge Brennan nodded, looking like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. Sophie said she was on the student council at school, and they had been trying to report the bullying problem for 2 years. She said Principal Morrison kept dismissing their concerns, saying boys will be boys and that students needed to toughen up. She said it was not about being tough, though. Brad Carson and his friends had been terrorizing younger students all year. They targeted anyone they thought would not fight back. The teachers knew about it, but nothing ever happened, because Brad's father donated large amounts of money to the school athletic programs. Sophie said the system was broken when money and connections mattered more than doing what was right. David Chen added that Marcus was not the first person to get in trouble for defending someone else. He said there was a girl in his grade, Amy Lou, who got suspended for a week for pushing a boy who had been groping her in the hallway. The boy got 1 day of detention, David said. When students tried to speak up about unfair treatment, they were told to respect authority and stop making trouble. He said the message was clear that some students mattered more than others, and that standing up for yourself or others would only make things worse for you. The system, he said, was not just broken, it was designed to protect the wrong people. Judge Brennan looked like a man drowning in the weight of revelations he could no longer ignore. He said he wanted a full report on disciplinary actions at the school for the past 3 years, broken down by student demographics. He said if the data showed a pattern of discrimination, he would refer the matter to the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. He said he would also be reviewing cases from his own courtroom to see if similar patterns existed there. He turned to the SEAL team and said they had come to defend one boy, but had shed light on systemic problems that needed addressing. He said he could not undo 25 years of cases, but he could make sure that moving forward, every child in his courtroom would be judged on facts, not on assumptions, about their race or background or circumstances. Commander Webb nodded slowly and said, that was all anyone could ask. He said change had to start somewhere, and this was as good a place as any. Judge Brennan said he wanted Marcus and Commander Webb to remain after the formal proceedings ended, because he had something personal he needed to say. The judge declared court adjourned, and everyone stood as he stepped down from the bench. Instead of leaving through his private door, he walked around to where Marcus stood with his father. He had removed his judicial robe, and now he was just Harold Brennan, an old man confronting the consequences of his failures. The judge spoke directly to Marcus, his voice rough with emotion. He said he wanted to tell the boy something man to man. He said what he had done that day was unforgivable. He had looked at Marcus and seen what he expected to see instead of who Marcus actually was. He had seen a stereotype instead of a person. He had seen assumptions instead of truth. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box worn smooth with age. Opening it, he revealed a medal tarnished with time but still recognizable as a Bronze Star. He said it had belonged to his father, who earned it in Vietnam pulling 3 wounded men from a burning helicopter under enemy fire. His father had taught him that courage meant doing what was right when it would be easier to do nothing. Judge Brennan said that Marcus had shown that kind of courage and he had not. He extended the box toward Marcus and said he wanted the boy to have it. He said it was not payment for what he had done because nothing could pay for that. He said it was a reminder that even when the world judged you unfairly, your actions spoke louder than their words. He said Marcus should keep it and remember that one old man's prejudice did not define his worth or his character. Marcus looked at his father, who nodded permission. The boy took the box with both hands and thanked the judge quietly. Judge Brennan said no thanks were necessary and that he was the one who should be grateful for the lesson he had learned that day, even though it had come at Marcus's expense. Commander Webb extended his hand to the judge and said second chances were what they fought for. He said everyone deserved the opportunity to do better and be better. Judge Brennan shook his hand and said he would spend whatever time he had left on the bench trying to live up to that standard. The SEAL team stood at ease near the back of the courtroom, watching the exchange with approval. Chief Cole said quietly to Lieutenant Palmer that maybe some good would come from this after all. Palmer nodded and said the kid had more courage than most men twice his age, and his father had every right to be proud. Mrs. Green approached Commander Webb and said she was glad he made it home in time. She said she had been trying everything she could think of to delay the proceedings, but the system had worked against her at every turn. Jacob thanked her for fighting for his son when he could not be there himself. She said it was her job, but also that Marcus was a good kid who deserved better than what he had gotten. She said she would be following up on the judge's orders regarding the school and would make sure the other boys faced appropriate consequences. She also said she would be filing complaints against the officers who had mishandled the initial investigation and against the school administrators who had covered up the truth. Officer Price came over and apologized for his part in things. He said he should have questioned the rush to judgment but had just followed orders. Commander Webb said he understood that following orders was part of the job, but that everyone had a responsibility to speak up when something was wrong. Price said he would remember that going forward. He also said he had worked in the courthouse for 15 years and had never seen Judge Brennan speak to a child the way he had spoken to Marcus that day. He said something had been off about the whole case from the beginning, and he wished he had trusted his instincts. The group moved toward the courtroom exit together. Marcus walked beside his father, and the other SEALs flanked them like an honor guard. People in the hallway stopped and stared as they passed, but the SEALs paid them no attention. They had accomplished their mission, and now it was time to move on. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was bright and warm. Commander Webb put his hand on Marcus's shoulder and told him he was proud of the way he had handled himself. Marcus said he had been scared and angry, and had almost cried in front of everyone. Jacob said being scared did not mean you were not brave, and that showing emotion was not weakness. He said Marcus had stood up for his friend, told the truth, and kept his composure even when he was being treated unfairly. Those were the marks of a strong man. Lieutenant Palmer said they needed to get Commander Webb debriefed and back to base, but that they had a few hours first. He suggested they all get something to eat, and Marcus smiled for the first time that day. The next morning, Marcus woke to the smell of pancakes and bacon coming from the kitchen. He had slept better than he had in weeks without the weight of the court case hanging over him. He got dressed and went downstairs to find his father at the stove cooking breakfast, while his mother sat at the table reading the newspaper. She looked up and smiled when Marcus entered, and his father turned around with a spatula in hand, looking more relaxed than Marcus had seen him in a long time. They ate together as a family, talking about nothing important and everything important at the same time. It was normal and perfect, and Marcus wished it could last forever, even though he knew his father would have to leave again soon. After breakfast, Jacob said he needed to make some phone calls about the school situation. He spent an hour on the phone with Principal Morrison, and then with the superintendent of schools, and finally with someone from the school board. Marcus could hear his father's voice through the closed office door, calm and professional, but with an edge that suggested he would not accept excuses or delays. When Jacob finally emerged, he said he had scheduled meetings with school officials for the next day. He said Marcus would be returning to school on Monday and that certain assurances had been made about his safety and fair treatment. He said if those assurances were not kept, there would be consequences that the school would not like. The rest of the week passed in a blur of activity. Jacob took Marcus to his martial arts gym, where the instructor, Master Lee, welcomed them both. Jacob explained what had happened, and Master Lee listened carefully before nodding with approval. He said Marcus had used his training exactly as intended, to protect someone who could not protect themselves without causing unnecessary harm. He said that was the highest purpose of martial arts, and Marcus should be proud. He offered to work with Marcus on some additional techniques for dealing with multiple opponents, and for staying safe in school environments where fighting was not an option. Jacob thanked him, and they spent 2 hours on the mat working through scenarios and strategies. On Thursday, Jacob and Marcus met with Principal Morrison and 2 school board members in a conference room at the district office. The principal looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat and avoiding eye contact. Jacob laid out his concerns calmly but firmly. He said the initial incident had been mishandled at every level. The school had failed to protect Kyle from bullying. They had blamed Marcus for defending him. They had ignored witness statements that contradicted their preferred narrative. They had rushed to involve law enforcement without conducting a proper investigation. And they had built a disciplinary file on Marcus that reflected bias rather than facts. Jacob said this pattern needed to change immediately. The school board members assured Jacob that they took his concerns seriously. They said an independent investigation had been launched into disciplinary practices at the school. They said Principal Morrison would be required to undergo additional training on bias and proper investigation procedures. They said new protocols were being implemented to ensure student complaints about bullying were taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. They also said Brad Carson and his 2 friends had been suspended for the remainder of the semester and would face criminal charges. Jacob listened and said he appreciated the words but would be watching to see if actions matched promises. He said Marcus would return to school on Monday, and that any retaliation or unfair treatment would result in immediate legal action. Principal Morrison finally spoke up. His voice was defensive at first, trying to explain that he had acted on the information available to him. Jacob cut him off and said that was exactly the problem. Morrison had acted on assumptions instead of investigating. He had seen what he expected to see instead of what was actually there. The principal's face reddened, but he seemed to realize arguing would not help his situation. He apologized to Marcus directly and said he hoped they could start fresh. Marcus accepted the apology, but his expression made it clear that trust would have to be earned. The meeting ended with handshakes that felt stiff and formal, but at least it was a beginning. On Friday, Jacob took Marcus to visit Kyle and his mother. Linda Simmons welcomed them warmly, and Kyle brightened immediately when he saw Marcus. The two boys went out to the backyard while the adults talked in the living room. Kyle thanked Marcus again for helping him and asked if he was okay after everything that happened. Marcus said he was fine now and asked how Kyle was doing. Kyle admitted he had been having nightmares about the attack and his mother was taking him to see a counselor. But he said knowing that Brad and his friends were suspended and facing charges made him feel safer. He said he also felt less alone knowing that Marcus and other students had stood up for him. Marcus asked Kyle if he was going to be okay going back to school, and Kyle said he was nervous, but his mom had arranged for him to have a different bus route, so he would not run into Brad's friends. Marcus suggested that Kyle sit with him and his friends at lunch so he would not be alone. Kyle's face lit up, and he said that would be great. The two boys talked for a while longer about video games and school projects and normal kid things. It felt good to Marcus to see Kyle smiling and acting more like himself. When it was time to go, Linda hugged Marcus and thanked him again for being there for her son. She said the world needed more people like him and his father. Saturday was spent doing ordinary things that felt extraordinary because Jacob was there. They went to the hardware store to fix a leaky faucet. They washed the car together in the driveway, getting more water on each other than on the vehicle. They played basketball in the park with Marcus, trying to show his father the moves he had learned while Jacob was deployed. They had dinner at Marcus's favorite restaurant and talked about everything from school to sports to what Marcus wanted to be when he grew up. Marcus said he had been thinking about becoming a lawyer, someone who could help kids like Kyle and kids like himself get fair treatment. Jacob smiled and said that was a noble goal and that Marcus already had the most important qualities needed for that work: empathy and a sense of justice. Sunday morning they went to church with Carol. The congregation welcomed Jacob home with hugs and handshakes and prayers of gratitude for his safe return. The pastor mentioned during his sermon how the community had been praying for the Webb family during their recent difficulties and how God had seen them through. After the service, several people approached Marcus to tell him they had heard about what happened and were proud of him. Mrs. Johnson, who had known Marcus since he was a baby, hugged him and said he was growing into a fine young man. Mr. Williams, who taught Sunday school, said standing up for others was what Jesus would want, and Marcus had done the right thing. The support from their church family meant more than Marcus could express, and he felt himself tearing up, despite trying to stay composed. That afternoon, Jacob sat Marcus down for a serious conversation. He said he had to leave the next morning to return to base and then would be deploying again within a few weeks. He said he did not know how long he would be gone or where he would be going because those details were classified. He said this was the hardest part of his job, leaving his family behind while he went into danger. But he said he did it because he believed in protecting people who could not protect themselves on a much larger scale. He said that was the same principle Marcus had demonstrated when he helped Kyle, and that made him proud beyond words. He said Marcus was becoming the kind of man who made the world better, and that was all any father could hope for. Marcus asked his father if he was scared when he went on missions, and Jacob admitted that he was sometimes. He said fear was natural and only foolish people felt no fear. But he said courage was not the absence of fear, it was doing what needed to be done despite being afraid. He said Marcus had shown that kind of courage in the school parking lot and in the courtroom. He said the coming weeks and months might be hard as Marcus dealt with returning to school and with his father being gone again. But Jacob said he had complete confidence that Marcus would handle it with the same strength and integrity he had shown so far. He said Marcus's mother would be there and his teachers and friends would support him. And even though Jacob would be far away, he would carry Marcus with him in his heart every single day. They spent the evening as a family again, knowing it would be the last one for a while. Carol made Jacob's favorite meal, and they looked through photo albums remembering good times from the past. Marcus showed his parents his report card, which had arrived while Jacob was deployed. It was all high marks except for history, where he had gotten a lower grade because of the incident where he corrected the teacher. Jacob said he would be addressing that with the school as well, because curiosity and knowledge should be encouraged, not punished. Carol told stories about things Marcus had done while Jacob was away, both the challenging moments and the proud ones. Jacob listened with a mixture of sadness at what he had missed and joy at hearing about his son's growth. When it was time for bed, Jacob tucked Marcus in like he used to do when Marcus was small. He sat on the edge of the bed and told Marcus he loved him and was proud of him. Marcus said he loved his father too and would make him proud while he was gone. The sound of boots hitting the floor in perfect rhythm filled the courtroom like thunder rolling across the sky. 6 men entered through the doors, moving together with a precision that made it clear they had trained for thousands of hours as a unit. Every person in the courtroom turned to stare because it was impossible not to. These were not ordinary men in suits coming to watch a trial. These were warriors in full dress uniform, and their presence changed the entire atmosphere of the room in an instant. The gold trident insignia on their chests caught the light and seemed to glow. Every ribbon and medal told a story of sacrifice and valor that most people could only imagine. Leading the group was a man who seemed to command attention just by existing. Commander Jacob Webb stood tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the color of dark mahogany, and eyes that had seen things most people would never comprehend. His uniform was immaculate without a single thread out of place, and his bearing was that of a man who had faced death and walked away. The ribbons on his chest formed a rainbow of colors that spoke of battles fought in places whose names were classified. There was the Navy Cross second only to the Medal of Honor. There were silver stars and bronze stars with small V-shaped devices that indicated valor in combat. There was the Purple Heart that meant he had bled for his country. His face was stern and carved with lines that came from responsibility and hard decisions. But his eyes softened for just a moment when they found Marcus sitting at the defendant's table. Behind Commander Webb came 5 more men, each one moving with the same deadly grace. Lieutenant Greg Palmer was broad as a door with blonde hair cut military short and a jaw that looked like it could break concrete. His blue eyes swept the room, taking in every detail, every exit, every potential threat, even though they were in a courthouse in America. Petty Officer First Class Antonio Cruz was shorter and compact with the build of a boxer and eyes that missed nothing. Petty Officer Second Class Kevin Harris moved like a cat, all controlled power and awareness, with dark skin and a scar running from his left eyebrow into his hairline. Petty Officer Second Class Shane Murphy had red hair and freckles that made him look younger than he was, but his eyes held the same hard edge as the others. Chief Petty Officer Raymond Cole was the oldest of the group, with gray threading through his dark hair and a face weathered by 3 decades of service in the most elite military unit in the world. They came to a halt in front of Judge Brennan's bench and stood at attention in perfect unison. The judge had gone pale as milk and his mouth hung open slightly. His hands gripped the edge of his desk, and the papers he had been holding fluttered to the floor unnoticed. Officer Price had frozen in mid-step, his hand still reaching for Marcus. Mrs. Green stood up slowly, her eyes wide with something that looked like relief mixed with vindication. The prosecutor looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, but he did not care anymore because his dad was here and everything was going to be okay. Commander Webb's voice when he spoke was not loud, but it carried through the courtroom like a bell. He said he was Commander Jacob Webb of SEAL Team 7, and that he understood the judge had been discussing him. The words were polite, but there was steel underneath them that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Judge Brennan tried to speak, but no sound came out at first. He cleared his throat twice before managing to say that he was not aware the commander would be attending this hearing. Jacob Webb replied that he had arrived stateside from his deployment only 3 hours ago and had come directly to the courthouse as soon as he learned his son was being arraigned. Marcus whispered "Dad," and his voice cracked on the word. Jacob looked at his son, and his expression softened for just a moment. He told Marcus to stand tall and remember what he had been taught. Then his gaze returned to the judge and became hard as iron again. He apologized for the dramatic entrance, but explained that the situation required immediate attention. Lieutenant Palmer stepped forward and handed a thick folder to Officer Price, who took it with shaking hands and passed it up to Judge Brennan. Palmer explained that the folder contained Commander Webb's complete service record proof of his current deployment status, verification of his identity, and security clearance documentation. There were also statements from Marcus's school principal and several witnesses to the incident in question. Judge Brennan fumbled with the folder, his hands trembling so badly that pages slipped out and drifted to the floor. With each document he reviewed, his face grew redder, and sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He loosened his collar and kept glancing up at the seals as if hoping they might disappear if he looked away and back again. Commander Webb continued speaking in that same calm voice that somehow filled every corner of the room. He said that his son had been defending a smaller child from assault by 3 older students, and that Marcus had not been the aggressor. He said Marcus had used the minimum force necessary to protect an innocent person, exactly as he had been trained to do. He said there were multiple witnesses who would verify this account and that video footage from the school security cameras supported Marcus's version of events completely. Mrs. Green seized the moment and presented her own evidence. She had sworn statements from Kyle Simmons, the boy Marcus had defended, as well as from 2 other students who had witnessed everything. She explained that she had been requesting this evidence for weeks, but had been stonewalled by the school administration. She said she had also made 6 documented attempts to contact Commander Webb through proper military channels, but his classified deployment status had delayed all communication. The prosecution had been aware of these circumstances, she said, and had chosen to rush the case through anyway. Judge Brennan had denied her motion for a continuance, with a notation in the file claiming that no verifiable military service could be confirmed for Marcus's alleged father. Petty. Officer Cruz spoke up, saying with respect that was not accurate according to the court records. He said Mrs. Green had filed all proper documentation requesting a delay until Commander Webb could return from deployment. He said that request had been denied with prejudicial language that suggested the judge had assumed Marcus was lying about his father. Chief Cole added that the Judge Advocate General's corps had been contacted about these proceedings, and they were very interested in how a case involving the minor, son of a deployed service member, had been rushed through without proper notification. He said there were specific federal protections for military families that appeared to have been violated. The silence in the courtroom was broken only by the sound of the judge's heavy breathing and the quiet hum of the ventilation system. Judge Brennan set down the papers and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes as if trying to wake from a nightmare. When he looked up again, his face had lost all of its earlier arrogance and certainty. He looked like a man who had just realized he had made a terrible mistake, and that the consequences were standing right in front of him wearing Navy SEAL tridents. Commander Webb took one measured step closer to the bench. He said he did not know what had happened in this courtroom, or what assumptions had been made, or what prejudices had been at play. He said what he did know was that his 12-year-old son had stood up for someone who could not defend themselves and had used exactly the kind of courage and restraint that Webb himself had taught him. The commander's voice grew harder as he continued. He said he had faced enemy combatants in 14 different countries over his career. He said he had been shot at and blown up and nearly drowned. He said he had seen his brothers in arms die beside him and had held their hands as they took their last breaths. But nothing he said had ever made him angrier than learning that his son had stood in an American courtroom and been mocked and humiliated and called a liar for telling the truth about who his father was. He said Marcus had been brave enough to defend the weak and honest enough to tell the truth, and in return he had been sentenced to jail while the actual attackers walked free. He asked Judge Brennan if that was the kind of justice the American legal system was supposed to provide. Judge Brennan looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk and disappear. His face had gone from red to gray and his hands would not stop shaking. He opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. Finally, he managed to say that he owed Commander Webb and Marcus a profound apology. Mrs. Green cut him off sharply, saying that an apology was not enough. She said the judge had made assumptions about a child based purely on bias. She said he had sentenced an innocent boy to detention for defending someone from assault. She said he had called that boy a liar for telling the truth about his decorated military father. An apology, she said, did not undo that trauma or that injustice. Marcus found his voice again, and it came out stronger than before. He said Judge Brennan, his dad, had taught him that everyone makes mistakes, but what matters is what you do after you make them. He said true strength was not about being the biggest or the strongest, but about doing what was right even when it was hard. The words hung in the air, and several of the SEALs smiled slightly with pride. Commander Webb spoke with measured words that carried the weight of hard-earned authority. He said he did not want special treatment for his son because of his military service, but he did want Marcus treated fairly, like every child deserved. He said what happened in this courtroom was a symptom of a much larger problem. He asked how many other children had stood in that same spot and been judged not on facts but on assumptions and prejudices. He asked how many parents could not afford to take time off work to defend their kids. He asked how many children did not have a team of Navy SEALs who could walk through those doors and demand justice. The questions hung in the air heavy with implications that made everyone in the courtroom uncomfortable because they all knew the answers, even if nobody wanted to say them out. Loud Petty Officer Murphy, who had been silent until that moment, stepped forward. His voice was quiet but intense when he spoke. He said he had been one of those kids without anyone to speak for him. When he was 14, he got arrested for shoplifting even though he had not stolen anything. He was in a convenience store when another kid grabbed some candy and ran out. The security guard saw Murphy standing near the door and assumed he was involved because he was a black kid in a hoodie. The guard grabbed him and called the police, and nobody believed Murphy's story. His mother was working 3 jobs trying to keep food on the table and could not take time off for court dates. The public defender barely spoke to him before his hearing. The judge looked at Murphy's address in a poor neighborhood, looked at his skin color, and decided he was guilty. Murphy spent 6 months in juvenile detention for something he did not do. He said that experience could have ruined his life, but a military recruiter saw something in him that nobody else had bothered to look for. The recruiter helped him get his record expunged, helped him finish high school, and showed him a path forward. That was why Murphy wore the uniform now. But he said he thought about that judge every single day. He wondered how many other kids that judge had sentenced based on appearance rather than evidence. He wondered how many lives had been destroyed by assumptions and bias. He looked at Marcus and said the boy was lucky to have a father who taught him right from wrong and who came home to fight for him. Not every kid had that, and the system needed to work for all of them, not just the ones with parents who could demand justice. Sophie Martinez, who was still in the courtroom, raised her hand tentatively and asked if she could say something. Judge Brennan nodded, looking like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. Sophie said she was on the student council at school, and they had been trying to report the bullying problem for 2 years. She said Principal Morrison kept dismissing their concerns, saying boys will be boys, and that students needed to toughen up. She said it was not about being tough, though. Brad Carson and his friends had been terrorizing younger students all year. They targeted anyone they thought would not fight back. The teachers knew about it, but nothing ever happened because Brad's father donated large amounts of money to the school athletic programs. Sophie said the system was broken when money and connections mattered more than doing what was right. David Chen added that Marcus was not the first person to get in trouble for defending someone else. He said there was a girl in his grade, Amy Lou, who got suspended for a week for pushing a boy who had been groping her in the hallway. The boy got 1 day of detention. David said when students tried to speak up about unfair treatment, they were told to respect authority and stop making trouble. He said the message was clear that some students mattered more than others, and that standing up for yourself or others would only make things worse for you. The system, he said, was not just broken, it was designed to protect the wrong people. Judge Brennan looked like a man drowning in the weight of revelations he could no longer ignore. He said he wanted a full report on disciplinary actions at the school for the past 3 years, broken down by student demographics. He said if the data showed a pattern of discrimination, he would refer the matter to the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. He said he would also be reviewing cases from his own courtroom to see if similar patterns existed there. He turned to the SEAL team and said they had come to defend one boy, but had shed light on systemic problems that needed addressing. He said he could not undo 25 years of cases, but he could make sure that moving forward, every child in his courtroom would be judged on facts, not on assumptions about their race or background or circumstances. Commander Webb nodded slowly and said, that was all anyone could ask. He said change had to start somewhere, and this was as good a place as any. Judge Brennan said he wanted Marcus and Commander Webb to remain after the formal proceedings ended, because he had something personal he needed to say. The judge declared court adjourned, and everyone stood as he stepped down from the bench. Instead of leaving through his private door, he walked around to where Marcus stood with his father. He had removed his judicial robe, and now he was just Harold Brennan, an old man confronting the consequences of his failures. The judge spoke directly to Marcus, his voice rough with emotion. He said he wanted to tell the boy something man to man. He said what he had done that day was unforgivable. He had looked at Marcus and seen what he expected to see instead of who Marcus actually was. He had seen a stereotype instead of a person. He had seen assumptions instead of truth. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box worn smooth with age. Opening it, he revealed a medal tarnished with time but still recognizable as a bronze star. He said it had belonged to his father, who earned it in Vietnam pulling 3 wounded men from a burning helicopter under enemy fire. His father had taught him that courage meant doing what was right when it would be easier to do nothing. Judge Brennan said that Marcus had shown that kind of courage and he had not. He extended the box toward Marcus and said he wanted the boy to have it. He said it was not payment for what he had done because nothing could pay for that. He said it was a reminder that even when the world judged you unfairly, your actions spoke louder than their words. He said Marcus should keep it, and remember that one old man's prejudice did not define his worth or his character. Marcus looked at his father, who nodded permission. The boy took the box with both hands and thanked the judge quietly. Judge Brennan said no thanks were necessary and that he was the one who should be grateful for the lesson he had learned that day, even though it had come at Marcus's expense. Commander Webb extended his hand to the judge and said second chances were what they fought for. He said everyone deserved the opportunity to do better and be better. Judge Brennan shook his hand and said he would spend whatever time he had left on the bench, trying to live up to that standard. The SEAL team stood at ease near the back of the courtroom, watching the exchange with approval. Chief Cole said quietly to Lieutenant Palmer that maybe some good would come from this after all. Palmer nodded and said the kid had more courage than most men twice his age, and his father had every right to be proud. Mrs. Green approached Commander Webb and said she was glad he made it home in time. She said she had been trying everything she could think of to delay the proceedings, but the system had worked against her at every turn. Jacob thanked her for fighting for his son when he could not be there himself. She said it was her job, but also that Marcus was a good kid who deserved better than what he had gotten. She said she would be following up on the judge's orders regarding the school and would make sure the other boys faced appropriate consequences. She also said she would be filing complaints against the officers who had mishandled the initial investigation and against the school administrators who had covered up the truth. Officer Price came over and apologized for his part in things. He said he should have questioned the rush to judgment, but had just followed orders. Commander Webb said he understood that following orders was part of the job, but that everyone had a responsibility to speak up when something was wrong. Price said he would remember that going forward. He also said he had worked in the courthouse for 15 years and had never seen Judge Brennan speak to a child the way he had spoken to Marcus that day. He said something had been off about the whole case from the beginning and he wished he had trusted his instincts. The group moved toward the courtroom exit together. Marcus walked beside his father, and the other SEALs flanked them like an honor guard. People in the hallway stopped and stared as they passed, but the SEALs paid them no attention. They had accomplished their mission, and now it was time to move on. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was bright and warm. Commander Webb put his hand on Marcus's shoulder and told him he was proud of the way he had handled himself. Marcus said he had been scared and angry and had almost cried in front of everyone. Jacob said being scared did not mean you were not brave and that showing emotion was not weakness. He said Marcus had stood up for his friend, told the truth, and kept his composure even when he was being treated unfairly. Those were the marks of a strong man. Lieutenant Palmer said they needed to get Commander Webb debriefed and back to base, but that they had a few hours first. He suggested they all get something to eat, and Marcus smiled for the first time that day. Monday morning came too quickly, and Marcus found himself standing in front of his school with his mother beside him. Carol had taken the morning off work to walk Marcus in for his first day back. She held his hand like she used to do when he was in elementary school, and Marcus did not pull away even though he was 12, and usually thought hand-holding was for little kids. He needed the comfort today because walking through those doors felt harder than facing the judge had been. At least in court he knew what to expect, but here anything could happen. Other students were staring at him as they walked past, some whispering to their friends. Marcus kept his head up, remembering what his father and the SEALs had told him about walking tall and not showing fear. They met with Principal Morrison in his office before classes started. The principal looked more humble than Marcus had ever seen him, almost apologetic in his manner. He explained that Marcus's teachers had been informed of the situation and instructed to treat him fairly. He said guidance counselors were available if Marcus needed to talk to someone. He said the school resource officer had been briefed and would be keeping an eye out for any problems. Carol thanked him, but her tone made it clear she expected actions, not words. She reminded Morrison that Marcus had done nothing wrong and should not be made to feel like a criminal, returning to the scene of a crime. Morrison assured her that was not his intention and that the school was committed to Marcus's success and well-being. Walking to his first period class, Marcus felt eyes on him from every direction. Some students looked at him with respect or curiosity. Others looked uncomfortable or hostile. A few people he did not know well gave him encouraging nods or smiles. Sophie Martinez caught up with him in the hallway and walked with him, asking how he was doing. Marcus said he was okay, just nervous. Sophie said she had told everyone who would listen what really happened, and that most people knew he was a hero, not a troublemaker. She said there would always be some people who believed what they wanted to believe regardless of facts, but that Marcus had more support than he probably realized. Her words helped settle the anxious feeling in his stomach. His first class was English with Mrs. Cooper, who had always been fair to him. She smiled when he walked in and welcomed him back without making a big deal of it. Marcus took his usual seat and tried to focus on the lesson about symbolism in literature. It was hard to concentrate when he kept expecting something bad to happen, but the period passed without incident. Between classes, a few students came up to say they were glad he was back, or to tell him they thought what he did for Kyle was brave. A girl named Amy from his math class said she had been bullied last year and wished someone like Marcus had stood up for her. Marcus thanked her and said he hoped she was okay now. She said she was better and that knowing people like him existed made her feel safer. Lunch was the hardest part of the day because the cafeteria was where social dynamics played out in full view. Marcus got his tray and looked around for a place to sit. His usual table had some of his friends, but there were also a few guys he did not know well, and he was not sure of their reaction. Before he could decide, Kyle appeared at his elbow asking if Marcus wanted to sit together. Marcus smiled and said sure, and they headed to a table near the windows. Within minutes, Sophie and David joined them, followed by Amy and two other students who had witnessed the parking lot incident. The table filled up with people who wanted to be associated with Marcus and his story, and Marcus realized that maybe things were going to be okay after all. Halfway through lunch, Brad Carson walked past their table with his head down, not making eye contact with anyone. He looked smaller somehow, like his suspension, and the criminal charges had deflated his swagger. One of his former friends was sitting at a different table, apparently having decided that loyalty to Brad was not worth the social cost. Marcus watched Brad sit alone at a corner table and felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and pity. He did not hate Brad exactly, but he did not feel sorry for him either. Brad had made choices and now faced consequences just like everyone else. Kyle noticed Marcus looking and asked if he was worried about Brad coming back. Marcus said no, because Brad had learned that actions have consequences and hopefully would make better choices going forward. The afternoon classes went smoothly with teachers, treating Marcus normally, which was exactly what he wanted. His history teacher, Mr. Peterson, actually apologized to Marcus privately for marking him down when he had corrected information about the Battle of Mogadishu. Peterson said he had looked up Marcus's correction and found that Marcus was right and he was wrong. He said he was changing Marcus's grade to reflect that and apologized for letting his ego get in the way of good teaching. Marcus appreciated the apology and said he understood that everyone makes mistakes. Peterson smiled and said Marcus was wise beyond his years and would go far in life if he kept that attitude. After school, Marcus waited at the flagpole where his mother had said she would pick him up. He did not want to take the bus yet, because he was not ready to deal with that enclosed environment where Brad's friends might still cause problems. While he waited, several students came by to talk to him. One was a sophomore named Chris, who said his older brother was in the Navy and that he thought it was awesome Marcus's dad was a SEAL. Another was a girl named Jennifer, who said she had written a report for her civics class about what happened to Marcus and how it showed problems with the justice system. Marcus thanked her and said he hoped something good would come from all the attention his case was getting. Carol arrived and drove Marcus home asking about his day. Marcus told her it had gone better than expected. He said some people were supportive, some were indifferent, and a few seemed resentful, but nobody had caused trouble. Carol said she was proud of how he handled himself and that she knew it was not easy going back. She said the first day was always the hardest and things would get easier as routines returned to normal. Marcus hoped she was right. When they got home, there was a package waiting on the doorstep addressed to Marcus. Inside was a Navy SEAL t-shirt with a note from Lieutenant Palmer, saying to stay strong and remember that Marcus had an entire team behind him. Marcus put the shirt on immediately and wore it for the rest of the evening. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new normal. Marcus went to school and did his work. He hung out with Kyle and Sophie and David, who had become close friends through the shared experience. He went to martial arts classes where Master Lee pushed him to improve his skills, while reinforcing the philosophy of using those skills only when absolutely necessary. He called his father whenever Jacob could find time to talk, which was not often, but Marcus treasured every conversation. Jacob was in a remote location doing things he could not discuss, but he always asked how Marcus was doing and reminded him to stay focused on being the best version of himself. The independent investigation into the school's disciplinary practices concluded after 6 weeks. The findings were damning, showing clear statistical evidence of racial bias in how punishments were assigned. Minority students received harsher penalties for the same infractions as white students, and were more likely to be suspended or expelled. The report recommended mandatory training for all staff, implementation of standardized disciplinary guidelines, and regular audits to ensure compliance. Principal Morrison was reassigned to a non-school position within the district, and a new principal was brought in with a background in restorative justice and equity. The new principal held assemblies to discuss the changes and invited student input on making the school safer and fairer for everyone. Mrs. Green followed through on her review of Judge Brennan's past cases. Out of 43 cases involving minority youth, she found 7 where the sentences appeared disproportionate to the offenses and where proper procedures had not been followed. All 7 cases were reopened and 4 of the sentences were reduced or vacated entirely. Judge Brennan issued public apologies to the families involved and announced that he would be retiring at the end of the year. He said he wanted to spend his remaining time on the bench trying to correct his past mistakes and ensure that no other child was treated the way Marcus had been. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the reforms being implemented in both the school system and the courthouse, calling it a watershed moment for justice in the community. Marcus received letters from 2 of the young people whose cases had been reopened. One was a girl named Keisha, who had been sentenced to 6 months for a first-time shoplifting offense. Her sentence had been reduced to community service and her record was being expunged. She wrote that she was now in college studying social work and wanted to help other kids navigate the system. She thanked Marcus for being brave enough to stand up even though it must have been terrifying. Another letter came from a boy named Terrell, who had been sent to juvenile detention for fighting when he was actually defending his younger sister from harassment. His record had been cleared and he wrote that he was working 2 jobs to save money for trade school. He said Marcus's story had given him hope that the system could change and that truth could win even when everything seemed stacked against it. 6 years passed with the kind of speed that makes people marvel at how quickly children become adults. Marcus grew taller and broader, filling out with the muscle that came from continued martial arts training and the discipline his father had instilled in him. He excelled in school, maintaining high grades while also becoming a leader among his peers. He joined the debate team where his ability to argue with facts and passion made him a standout. He volunteered at a community center tutoring younger kids and helping them with homework. He stayed close friends with Kyle and Sophie and David, all of whom were thriving in their own ways. Kyle had overcome his anxiety and joined the robotics team. Sophie was student body president, advocating for policy changes that made schools safer and more inclusive. David had been accepted to an elite science program at a nearby university, but the biggest changes were internal. Marcus had developed a deep understanding of justice and fairness that went beyond simple right and wrong. He read everything he could about the legal system, civil rights, and the ways society failed its most vulnerable members. He shadowed Mrs. Green during his junior and senior years, learning about family law and juvenile advocacy. She taught him how to interview clients, how to investigate cases, and how to build arguments that judges could not ignore. She told him he had a gift for seeing through surface details to underlying truth, and that gift would serve him well in whatever career he chose. Marcus knew what career he wanted, though. He wanted to be the person standing beside kids like he had been, making sure they were seen and heard and treated fairly. His father came home between deployments whenever he could. The visits were never long enough, but they were precious. Jacob watched his son grow with obvious pride, telling Carol that Marcus was becoming the kind of man the world desperately needed. During one visit when Marcus was 16, Jacob taught him advanced hand-to-hand combat techniques that went beyond what Master Lee covered. He said Marcus was old enough and mature enough to handle the responsibility that came with that knowledge. He made Marcus promise to use it only in true emergencies and only to protect innocent people. Marcus gave his word and kept it even when situations at school could have escalated into fights. Walking away from confrontation when you knew you could win took more strength than fighting, and Marcus understood that now. In his senior year, Marcus applied to several universities with strong pre-law programs. His essay about experiencing injustice firsthand and being inspired to fight for others was powerful and authentic. It earned him acceptance letters from multiple schools, including full scholarships to 2 of them. He chose a state university 3 hours from home with an excellent political science program and connections to top law schools. Carol cried when he made his decision, both proud of his achievement and sad that her baby was leaving home. Jacob was deployed when the acceptance letters came, but he sent a video message congratulating Marcus and telling him this was just the beginning of a journey that would impact countless lives. The SEAL team sent a group message, as well, with each man offering congratulations and advice for college life. Graduation day was bright and sunny, with Marcus standing among 300 classmates, waiting to receive his diploma. Carol sat in the audience beaming with pride, wearing the corsage Marcus had given her that morning. Next to her sat Mrs. Green, who had become like family over the years. Also in attendance were Kyle and his mother Sophie's parents, David's family, and several teachers who had supported Marcus. Master Lee was there in a suit instead of his usual training gear, looking uncharacteristically formal. And in the back row, trying to remain inconspicuous, were 5 men in civilian clothes, who Marcus recognized immediately even without their uniforms. The SEAL team had come. After the ceremony, Marcus found them waiting near the parking lot. Lieutenant Palmer, who was now a full commander, shook Marcus's hand and said they would not have missed this for anything. Chief Cole, now retired from active duty, said watching Marcus graduate felt like watching his own son achieve something great. Petty Officer Cruz said Marcus had made everyone who knew his story proud. Petty Officer Harris said the world was lucky to have someone like Marcus entering the legal profession. Petty Officer Murphy said he expected great things and knew Marcus would deliver. They presented him with a gift, a leather portfolio engraved with his initials and the SEAL trident. Inside was a letter signed by all of them, expressing their confidence in his future and their gratitude for reminding them why they served. Carol invited everyone back to the house for a celebration. The small home was packed with people eating cake and sharing stories. Mrs. Green cornered Marcus and told him she had spoken to several lawyers she knew and had lined up a summer internship for him at a